Hello everyone, Professor Krizluk here. So I wanted to make a video about life in an authoritarian regime. So in 2017, Thomas Pepinsky, who's a professor of government at Cornell University, published a pretty interesting article in Vox, VOX in Vox. And he kind of tried to break down misconceptions about what life in an authoritarian regime is. So, when we think about an autocracy, Pepinsky argues that many people associate authoritarianism with the extreme. Maybe the violent totalitarianism of the 20th century, regimes like Nazi Germany or Stalinist USSR, where there'd be purges, there'd be mass violence, there'd be crackdowns on all aspects of society. Pepinsky argues, though, that most contemporary authoritarian states are far less dramatic. They really blend elements of democracy, like elections, with authoritarian practices like media controlled intimidation of the opposition, and much less violence than, say, regimes of the 20th century, again, like Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany. We see other political scientists talk about competitive authoritarianism. This includes Stephen Levinsky and Lucien Way, who again write about competitive authoritarianism, a regime that has democratic institutions in some form but not in practice. So when we think about daily life in a modern authoritarian regime, so contrary to the belief that authoritarianism is all persuasive and terrifying, he argues that in many modern authoritarian regimes, daily life is surprisingly normal. People live their lives really like a lot of people in a democracy do. Citizens still go to work, they still study at university, they still study in school, and they socialize like in many democracies. Even if the government's an authoritarian regime, people still kind of go about their daily lives doing things that people in a democracy do. So authoritarianism then often operates in the background. Political freedoms are curtailed, but economic and social routines are relatively normal. So let's think about that for a second. Political freedoms are curtailed. Again, elections might occur, but they might not matter. In a democracy, you might want to and be able to get involved in politics if you want. In these authoritarian regimes, maybe you can't. Other aspects of life for many citizens remain the same. You go to work, you study, you have your family, maybe you have your social clubs, you can play your athletics. Many of those aspects of life remain normal, but you can't necessarily be involved in politics because authoritarian regimes frequently hold elections which maintain a veneer of legitimacy. But those elections are rigged. These processes are used to ensure that the ruling party remains in power. When we think about examples, and these were the examples that the author used, he used the example of Russia under Vladimir Putin, Turkey under Erdogan, where elections exist, but they are heavily tilted in favor of the incumbent. So since the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a crackdown of civil society, a bigger crackdown of society. But certainly in 2017, when the author is writing this piece, Putin was still consolidating power, so it wasn't as authoritarian as it is today. But the point still stands that elections exist, but are heavily tilted in favor of the incumbent. So let's think about dissent in these situations. So there is tolerance of limited dissent. While overt political activism may be dangerous, so we can see this in Russia, where if 10,000 people went to the streets in Moscow, that could be dangerous for the protesters. But we know that authoritarian governments often tolerate or ignore minor private complaints. An example I've used in several videos is trash collection protests in Russia. The authorities accept it. No real crackdown. These aren't political protests, though. These aren't crackdowns against political protests. So this limited space for criticism allows regimes to release some public pressure without threatening their control. If you can go in the street and protest because the local oligarch closed down the factory, or these are Russian examples, or the oligarch in a monotown cut workers' hours and workers are mad and they take to the street. That allows for some release of public frustration that are not threats to the regime. So we might think in a democracy that, yeah, we can protest. Well, in an authoritarian regime, you can protest as well. It's not a threat to the regime. And of course, there are outliers. In places like North Korea, yeah, protests are handled differently. But in many authoritarian regimes, remember, they aren't as totalitarian as they were in the 20th century. Autocrats have found ways to better manage society, to maintain power. And some of that is allowing some protests to occur. So you are releasing pressure. The frustration is against maybe the oligarchs, the business owners, the business class, not against Putin, not against those in power. And it can be used by those in power to redirect frustrations. So we see this in Russia. We see this in places like China, where private discontent might be tolerated unless it crosses into organized political movements that are against the state, against the power, against the Chinese Communist Party. So again, some discontent, some protests in an authoritarian regime, as long as it's not a threat to those in power. So again, in an authoritarian regime, in a modern authoritarian regime, most people are just living their lives. They're trying to survive like everyone else in the world. But where the autocrats maintain control is through election, is through making sure there is not political discontent and political challenges to their authority. So the authors of the article, and remember it's a bit old, it's 8 years old now, so it's some time has passed, regimes are always evolving, but we highlighted about why citizens tolerate authoritarianism, and there's a wide variety of literature that looks like this, not simply just one article. And so when we think about why citizens tolerate authoritarianism, one school of thought says that many citizens prefer the stability and predictability that authoritarian regimes can offer. This is especially true in places with recent histories of conflict and economic crises. So maybe an autocrat comes in, promises to restore stability, to grow the economy, and people are okay with that. Again, if, as Pepinsky says, life remains pretty normal, and then you have economic growth, you have stability, that people aren't as likely, again, there's some debate in the scholarship, but aren't as likely to demand change. So in exchange for limited political freedoms, people may gain consistent public services, economic growth, maybe a sense of national pride. The author uses the example of in Singapore, the ruling People's Action Party has maintained control by delivering high standards of living and order. In Putin's Russia, we see the same thing. In 2000 to 2008, we saw pretty spectacular economic growth under Vladimir Putin. As oil prices boomed, as the economy boomed, off the back of high oil prices, the economy grew. And so as the quality of life, we can chart this we can look at GDP per person, PPP. We can see that life for many Russians was getting better. It wasn't the democracy, it was an emerging authoritarian regime, but people's lives were certainly increasing. So just a few concluding takeaways. Pepinsky concludes that the boring and tolerable nature of many authoritarian regimes make them harder to recognize and resist. So sure, some people accept that it's an authoritarian regime because they just want stability. Others, you might, if there are still elections, if there are still some rules of the game, some citizens might not even realize that their country is sliding and has slid or is sliding into an authoritarian regime. So Pepinsky concludes that these regimes are boring and tolerable. They're not, again, like Stalinist Russia, where you had just mass repression and mass murder under Stalin's purges. A modern authoritarian regime doesn't look like that. Again, most people are just living their lives, so they might not even realize the slide into authoritarianism. This subtlety, Pepinsky argues, is dangerous because it normalizes authoritarian practices and lulls citizens into complacency. Again, so maybe even some citizens are fine with authoritarianism. Others might not even realize it has emerged. And when I say they're fine with authoritarianism, I mean that they just want stability. They want economic growth. They're busy just trying to survive. A leader says they're going to help their economic situation get better. They don't sit down and say, oh, I wish I had an autocrat as a leader. But instead, they just want some stability. Maybe it's emerging out of a civil war, or it's emerging out of a terrible economic crisis. They just want stability, and they are more concerned about economic growth and surviving than they are of, okay, we have multiple parties competing in a parliamentary system. So when we say that people are accepting of that, that's what we mean. So Pepinsky concludes, and the final point I'll bring up, is that the lessons for democracies are clear, that we should not mistake calm and quiet for a healthy democracy, which I think is an interesting point as we see the emergence of more authoritarian regimes around the world. We see the backsliding of some democracies around the world. When we look at Freedom House scores, the Freedom House Index scores, we do see some democratic backsliding around the world. So as political scientists, as people that study this, they argue that, hey, we might have some democratic backsliding around the world. They articulate it with data. But Pepinsky says that this can be a slow process that maybe some people miss. Maybe we don't even realize there's a backsliding of democracy into authoritarianism because, as he says, it's kind of boring. It's not in your face all the time authoritarianism. Okay, I just thought that was an interesting article. I wanted to talk to you all about it. Okay, thank you.